Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to Chapter 8 of our Democracies at War lectures. We will have a look today at the decision-making process at the origin of Western liberal democracies' wars. We saw in our Chapter 7 dealing with drone warfare that in America, under the Obama administration, the kill list, establishing the names of those individuals that were to be hit by drone strikes. This list was established by the CIA, and it was signed by President Obama. Drone warfare therefore reflects the primacy of the executive, and in doing so, it somehow undermines a democracy, a point we saw last week too. It undermines democracy because liberal democracies are supposed to be organized on the principle of the separation of powers. That is to say, a kind of balance, or at least checks and balances among both, on the one hand, the executive, and on the other hand, the legislative. If then there is a primacy of one of these two bodies, this is a bit astonishing in a regime claiming to be democratic. It is this point, ladies and gentlemen, that I would like to deepen in today's chapter 8. And the main point I will put forward consists in saying that our presidents, or prime ministers in the case of the UK, when taking decisions to go to war, should be called untamed princes. The expression is a reference, of course, to Machiavelli's The Prince, but also to Harvey Mansfield, an American political theorist, his book Taming the Prince. You see that Mansfield also edited an American version of The Prince. The Prince has not been tamed. He's untamed in the main foreign policy decision. When you look at the subtitle of Mansfield's book, The Ambivalence of the Modern Executive Power, I claim that in the domain of foreign affairs, in the domain of foreign policy decision-making relative to going to war, our princes are not tamed. Which amounts to saying, ladies and gentlemen, that in the case of America, the presidents are imperial presidents. This is a reference to Arthur Schlesinger's book, The Imperial Presidency in France. This imperial presidency is called le domaine réservé. We will see in our chapter 9 next week that this primacy of the executive is reinforced by the media, at least by mainstream media, which do not play the role of the fourth estate they are, or that they were supposed to play. So my underlying assumption in both chapters 8 and 9 consists in saying that Western liberal democracies not merely betray their liberal values when launching their wars, this is what we will see in chapter 10, but they also violate the democratic principles on which they are based when the decisions to launch these wars are taken, precisely because the principle of separation of powers is no longer respected, precisely because the citizens who, according to Kant's perpetual peace essay, are supposed to consent to the wars launched by their leaders, now citizens precisely do not check what the decision makers decide when they launch the wars that we are interested in analyzing. So let's have a look at the primacy of executive power today. This idea, the idea that the executive power should conduct a foreign policy in general and decide more specifically whether wars should or not be fought. this idea of the primacy of the executive power goes back to the first modern political thinker, that is to say Machiavelli, precisely before being revisited by notably Thomas Hobbes as regards international political thought, and shared also by more contemporary realist scholars, more specifically Morgenthau in his Politics Among Nations. And what is both astonishing and interesting and relevant, not merely do realist philosophers or thinkers or theorists presuppose the primacy of postulates, the primacy of the executive power, but so do liberal thinkers too, from Locke to the American Federalists to Tocqueville. So we will have a look at first the realist tradition, then the liberal analysis, and then we will see how contemporary constitutions in the US and in France, and how contemporary constitutional practices in both Western democracies do end up definitely favoring the primacy of the executive. So Machiavelli, first. Machiavelli, you know, that wrote, among many essays, two major philosophical essays, The Prince on the one hand, and discourses on the first decade of Titus Livius. The first essay, The Prince, is his most famous essay. Of course, he conceived it as a gift to Lorenzo di Medici, the Prince of Florence, Lawrence the Magnificent, whom he invited to set the then Italian peninsula free from the barbarians. You know that Italy at that time was divided into 10, 12, 15 different city-states, political units, some republics, others princedoms. And this Italian peninsula, had been torn by wars among the different entities, and the two major powers at that time, the French and the Spanish Habsburgs, had interfered in order to become the hegemonic power in Europe. And this is the background of Machiavelli appealing to a prince, a magnificent prince, who, according to him, should be able to unify Italy in order to get rid of these barbarians. So the Prince is a kind of essay full of political recommendations, a set of advice, of counsels given to the Prince, telling him what he should do, according to Machiavelli, in order to be successful, in order to be an efficient ruler, both in his domestic affairs and when dealing with foreign powers. And on the other hand, the discourses on the first decade of Titus Livy is a kind of nostalgic analysis of the Roman Republic before Rome turned into an empire. And it is also a critical, a hidden critical, concealed critical analysis of Renaissance Italy. So at first sight, we might say that there is a kind of contradiction. On the one hand, the Prince, an essay favorable to a monarchical, prospectively absolutist regime, and on the other hand, an essay favorable to Republican regime. How can we get out of this somehow contradiction? Well, when reading thoroughly the two essays, we see that there is one common point pursued by Machiavelli. His aim is to tell rulers, be they monarchic or republican, his aim is to tell them, I quote, how or what to do, or how to proceed to mantenere lo Stato, how to maintain their state. That is to say, the aim is to tell them what to do in order to promote what he calls the interest of the state. The interest of the state, not the reason of state. Ragione di Stato, the Italian expression, was used a bit later by other Italian thinkers of the 16th century, Giovanni Botero notably, but not by Machiavelli himself, but to some extent. The interest of state, interesse dello Stato, is synonymous with ragione di Stato. The interest of state, which will become the national interest in our domain of foreign policy from the end of the 18th century onward, from the French Revolution onward. So the aim of Machiavelli in the two essays is to tell the rulers, whatever the regime, what to do in order to establish, to maintain, and to consolidate the stability of a political unit, the stability necessary to profit to the unit itself, to the people living in the unit, and of course to the ruler, whatever the regime, the ruler themselves. And when we read carefully the discourses, what do we see? We see that, well, the regime, or the most appropriate regime, according to Machiavelli, depends on the context. So there is no general preference, neither for a monarchical regime or for a republican regime. Everything depends on the context. Listen to Machiavelli. To found a new republic at that time in the meaning of commonwealth, that is to say, what we would call now a state or nation state. To found a new republic, or to reform entirely the old institutions of an existing republic, must be the work of one man only. One man only, one prince only can found a republic or reform a republic, a state. Beyond this case, although one man only should organize a government, it will not endure on the long run if the administration remains on the shoulders of one single individual. It is well then that this government will be sustained by many. So the organization, the establishment, or the reform of a political unit should be taken into charge by one single man, the prince, while the opposite is true when it comes to govern a state in, we could say, a routine situation. So the republican form of government should be preferred when the political situation is stable. And when the political situation is not stable, then one single man, a prince, should be preferred. Why? Because in this case, the situation is somehow exceptional. The situation is exceptional when a state is formed, when it is created. It is exceptional when it is reformed or transformed. And it is exceptional, of course, when this unit has to defend itself against dangers. And in Machiavelli's essays, these dangers are twofold. They can be domestic or external. Listen to Machiavelli. I quote here the prince. There are two things which a prince has to fear. The one attempts against him by his own subjects. So the danger of domestic uprisings, domestic troubles, domestic revolutions. And the other danger, attacks from outside by powerful foreigners. So when a prince has to cope with these dangers, he will be the only one when a state has to cope with these dangers, domestic troubles, or threats emanating from outside powers. In this case, a prince is a monarchical regime is the best regime likely to successfully cope with these dangers. And Machiavelli comes to the conclusion that the art of war, notably against foreign threats, the art of war is the only art that is expected of him who commands. So by definition, by essence, decisions to wage wars and how to conduct them concretely, these decisions belong by essence to the prince, who is the only one likely to permit the political unit concerned to successfully survive such a threat, be it a domestic civil war or an external international war. So Machiavelli is favorable to the monopoly of the prince when it comes to cope with exceptional situations, and in our case here, foreign threats. This approach, which somehow is synonymous with Machiavelli's elitism, of course, is corroborated by the distinction that he makes between precisely the rationality of the prince and the superiority of the prince, and logically the inferiority of average people. And in order to easily remember his analysis, we should focus on the four words starting with the letter P in Italian. So we have the prince in his palace, principe palazzo, and Machiavelli opposes the prince in his palace to il popolo, the people, on the public place, la piazza. So principe palazzo as opposed to popolo, piazza. This is the elitist view of Machiavelli. There is a radical separation that should be made between the prince and average individuals. Here's a subject. Listen to this. The people, average people, is often deceived by an elusive good and therefore desire their own ruin. The people, average people, are unable to know what we would call the public good, the interest of the state, the national interest. People does not know what this national interest consists in. Listen to this. An excited multitude as opposed to a rational individual, the prince. An excited multitude will have promptly to create a chief for itself, who shall direct and keep them united and provide for their defense. People themselves cannot defend themselves. They need a chief, a prince. A bit further on in the discourses, a multitude without a chief is useless. A multitude without a chief is useless. The judgments of men, of ordinary men, in important manners are erroneous until they are directed by a superior man. So the prince is absolutely necessary. He only has the virtù, the excellence, the knowledge, the talent, etc., to cope, to take those decisions that permit the unit to cope successfully with dangers, in our case, dangers emanating from foreign powers. The prince is the only person, listen to Machiavelli, capable of changing radically, of adapting the behavior necessary, according according to what the winds of fortune, la fortuna, according to what the winds of fortune tell him. So a prince is able to know what to do when it comes to cope with fortuna, that is to say, with the existing political reality. And this will permit the state to be maintained, and therefore also the people to survive. Machiavelli's thesis put forward during the first decades of the 16th century were rediscovered and all at once shared and modified by the second major realist political philosopher, that is to say, Thomas Hobbes, in his Leviathan. Shared and modified at once for the following reason. You know that Thomas Hobbes is a contractualist thinker, that is to say, he distinguishes the situation in which individuals are living now in political units, in nation states, in commonwealths, and the situation before these nation states were created, these political societies were created, that is to say, the state of nature. And so the state of nature among men, which then he transfers to his analysis of international politics, the state of nature among the nation states, among independent units, is synonymous with a never-ending state of war. So the state of nature among men was a state of war. Therefore, men decided to get out of it by precisely signing a social covenant, a social a contract which permitted them to establish a political unit, a Leviathan, which stabilizes the situation of those people living within the unit concerned. That is to say, while Machiavelli distinguished two kinds of dangers a political union had to cope with, either domestic troubles, civil wars, and actually international dangers, foreign threats, Hobbes claims that thanks to the Leviathan, stability or peace is guaranteed within the state, whereas the state of war goes on exclusively in the relations between the political unit and other political units. That is to say, there are no more domestic threats because of the Leviathan's capacity to maintain a domestic order. And this is the reason why men decided to establish such a political unit, because it guaranteed them their security within the state, but threats go on existing because they emanate from other powers which are independent by definition from the first state concerned. In other words, Machiavelli's exception or Machiavelli's exceptions, which from time to time threatened lo Stato, the stability of a state, both from inside and from outside. In Hobbes' philosophy, there is only one exception left: dangers emanating, threats emanating from outside. But to some extent, this exception will be permanent because the international relations of a state, its interactions with the outside world, is by definition taking place in the never-ending state of war. So the exception becomes the rule in the domain of foreign affairs. What does that mean? This means that the primacy of the executive, or the primacy of the prince, able to know what to do to cope with foreign threats in Machiavelli, will, in Hobbes' philosophy, become the rule when it comes to dealing with foreign affairs. That is to say, foreign policy decisions to some extent, by definition, and not merely exceptionally, always foreign policy decision will belong to the ruler, and the ruler will therefore be called the sovereign representative. the sovereign representative. It belongs to the sovereign representative to decide what to do in order to to successfully cope with foreign threats. Sovereign representative. The expression is pretty interesting, also because potentially contradictory. It comes close to an oxymoron, at least at first sight. How can a representative be sovereign? Remember the meaning of sovereignty. Sovereignty means the absolute authority, the permanent authority. Of he who holds a sovereignty. So how can this ruler be representative if at the same time its authority is limitless? If it is limitless, it is not accountable. But if it is not accountable, how can it be representative to some extent? Actually, with this expression, Hobbes tries and manages to combine the two following points. The sovereign representative is representative because it emanates from the people. The people assigned the social covenant establishing the Leviathan, and the sovereign representative is sovereign when acting for the sake of the people's security. Why did primitive men leave the state of nature? Because they were unable to guarantee their security given the state of war, of every man against every other man, homo homini lupus. If then the different individuals decided to establish social covenants, a particular authority, since they were unable to guarantee their security, by definition, they must give the charge of guaranteeing their security to somebody else, since they were unable to do so. Otherwise, there would have been no need for them to establish such a political authority. Precisely therefore, the sovereign representative is sovereign when it comes to decide what to do to guarantee the security which individuals themselves were unable to guarantee without this political authority. To put it differently, in Hobbes' political philosophy, the government, and he was favorable to a monarchical absolutist government. He fled Great Britain during the revolution, during the Civil War, Cromwell's reign in the 1650s. He went to France, which was the typical absolutist monarchical regime. So in Hobbes' philosophy, the government, the executive power, could we say, is all at once dependent from the people as regards its origin, but it is independent from the people, and therefore not a republican when it comes to its policy actions. These policy actions can only be taken by the ruler themselves without consulting the people, which by definition does not know what to do in order to guarantee their security. Listen to Thomas Hobbes. It is to the great Leviathan, this mortal god, as he says, that we owe our peace and defense. It is to this authority that we owe our peace and our defense. This Leviathan, therefore, has the use of so much power and strength to form the wills of all the subjects. The wills of the subjects, of the inhabitants of a particular unit, are formed by the government in order, I quote, to cope, I quote, against their enemies abroad, in order to maintain a unit and the unit's inhabitants' security against their enemies abroad. The Leviathan must have all the power and strength needed in order to do so. So the political authority and the ruler forms the wills of the inhabitants. He is not dependent from these wills. He does not listen, and he should not listen to the opinions, the convictions, or the wills of the inhabitants within the unit. So Machiavelli, and then Thomas Hobbes, and last but not least, Morgenthau. Hans Morgenthau, contemporary classical realist of the 20th century, in his Politics Among Nations, we made a very quick allusion to this in our chapter 2, when looking at the impact of the democratic regime upon international relations theories. We saw that, according to Morgenthau, the statesman is supposed to be rational. He's supposed to act on the basis of the national interest defined in terms of power, but indirectly he acknowledged that in democracy sometimes the rationality of a statesman is limited, because he somehow has to listen to he thinks that he has to listen to the public opinion, and therefore the political recommendation of Morgenthau precisely consists in saying that there should be no democratic control. In order for the foreign policy to be rational, the statesman should not listen to the public opinion. Listen to Morgenthau, page 7 of his Politics Among Nations. Thinking required for the successful conduct of foreign policy can be diametrically opposed to the rhetoric and action by which the masses and their representatives are likely to be moved. So there is a distinction to be made, precisely as in Machiavelli's philosophy, between statesman, the prince, and average people. The statesman, I go on quoting, must think in terms of the national interest, conceived as power among other powers. The popular mind, public opinion, unaware of the fine distinctions of the statesman's thinking, public opinion is, stupid. The popular mind reasons more often than not in the simple moralistic and legalistic terms of absolute good and absolute evil. And this is exactly what a statesman should not listen to. The statesman must take the long view, as opposed to average people who want quick result. So the recommendation then is the following one: the government, to be successful in foreign policy, must be the leader and not the slave to public opinion. So the government should form the will of the inhabitants of his political unit, rather than listening to public opinion. So the Morgenthau is a perfect synthesis of Hobbes, the sovereign representative, and of Machiavelli's The Prince. Ladies and gentlemen, realists, thinkers and realist theorists are a conservative people. They are elitist thinkers, and therefore both their analyses and their recommendations are anything but a surprise. What is more astonishing, and all the more so relevant, therefore, is the fact that liberal thinkers too, past and present, liberal thinkers too, share almost perfectly the same idea of the primacy of the executive power when it comes to take foreign policy decisions, and more specifically when it comes to decide to go to war. I would like to start with the founder of liberal political philosophy and of liberal international theory in the meaning of Martin White, John Locke, in his second treatise of government. John Locke was the advisor of William of Orange, who was the ruler of the Netherlands at that time in the second half of the 17th century. Locke belongs to the generation, one generation after Thomas Hobbes's generation. And in 1688, thanks to the so-called Glorious Revolution, which put an end to 30 to 40 years of upheaval, instability in England and in Great Britain, in 1688, when William of Orange became King William III of England, he wrote his second treatise of government. And this Glorious Revolution in England permitted the parliamentary monarchy to prevail definitely in England, and then in Great Britain. It permitted to put an end, as I said, to the 40 years of instability due to Cromwell's republic, and to the attempts by those who had been able to get rid of Cromwell to re-establish a kind of absolutist monarchy. So this parliamentary or limited monarchy was based on the separation of powers, precisely. And it is the separation of powers principle which Locke deepens in his second treatise of government. In France, Montesquieu is pretty often considered to be at the origin of the doctrine of the separation of powers, and to some extent this is true because he distinguished those are three bodies, or those are three powers which still nowadays are distinguished. That is to say, the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. But he himself, Montesquieu, had been influenced precisely by John Locke. Though John Locke, when he distinguished his three powers, distinguished the executive and the legislative, but his third one was not the judicial. This is indeed Montesquieu's added value. He distinguished the third power, which he called the federative power, and it is this federative power which is important for us in our perspective of analyzing decision-making in the domain of foreign affairs. So the general principle of John Locke, of course, consists in distinguishing the executive power or body from the legislative power or legislative body. And this distinction, according to him, and the separation between the two is what characterizes precisely a liberal government. Listen to John Locke. The legislative and the executive power are in distinct hands. There are two different bodies. They are in different hands, in distinct hands, in all moderated monarchies, in all well-framed governments. So we reject absolutist monarchies, of course. And then he comes to the federative power. And the federative power, I quote his description of this federative power, contains the power of war and peace, of leagues and alliances, and all the transactions with all persons and communities without the Commonwealth, outside the Commonwealth, outside the political unit. That is to say that within a state and within a state's administration or government, this federative power is the power dealing with foreign affairs, taking those decisions that we would call foreign policy decisions. That is to say, those decisions related to the interactions, I quote, to the rest of mankind, which is in a state of nature. In Locke's philosophy, ladies and gentlemen, the state of nature, both among men and among commonwealths, among nation states, among independent unions, is not a state of war, as in Hobbes's philosophy. He criticizes Hobbes's philosophy. Remember that in John Locke's philosophy, the state of nature is a state of goodwill, of mutual assistance, of peace, of cooperation, and not of hostility, of never-ending war, as according to Hobbes. So we, to some extent, we could expect that he would propose another analysis of the body supposed to conduct foreign policy. Actually, this is not the case. He also is favorable to the primacy of the executive a power when it comes to adopt foreign policy decisions. So listen to John Locke. These two powers, executive and federative, the executive power regards the execution of laws adopted by the legislative power within the political unit in the domestic political stage. The federative power regards those decisions taken when it comes to deal with the rest of the world. So these two powers, I quote, executive and federative, though they be really distinct in themselves, are almost always united. So we should distinguish the powers, the substance, the contents of the policies concerned, but not the bodies holding this power. They should be, they are almost always, and they should be united. They are hardly, I quote, to be separated. The federative power should not be separated from the executive power, which amounts to saying that it belongs to the executive body to take those decisions that regard the federative power, that is to say, the domain of war and peace. Why should this be the case? According to John Locke, listen to him, various reasons, practical reasons. First, both of them, I quote, require the force. Police on the one hand, army on the other hand. So why should we distinguish them, practically speaking, given that both require the use of force? Somehow it comes closer to Machiavelli here. There is a second reason, I would say a more general one, a more fundamental one, which is related to the nature of foreign policy, which, though not being a state of war, nevertheless is different from domestic politics. Listen to Locke. What is to be done in reference to foreigners depends on the actions of these foreigners. That is to say, a state cannot know what another state can do, might do, will do. And the state cannot know what the intentions. This is very close to a realist claim. A state cannot know what other states' intentions may consist in, which amounts to saying that the legislative body's decisions, that is to say, the laws which permit stability within a state, these laws cannot foresee what another state might intend to do. The legislators, I quote, are not able to foresee and to provide by laws for all that may be useful to the community when dealing with outside foreigners whose intentions we cannot know. Therefore, this conclusion, the foreign policy decisions and actions, I quote, must be left in great part to the prudence of those who have this power committed to them in order to be managed by their skill for the advantage of the Commonwealth. The advantage of the Commonwealth to survive against prospective attacks, though there is no state of war, nevertheless, there can be hostile actions by foreign powers to cope with these foreign powers. We must have a body, a political body, likely to foresee what may occur. The legislative body is unable to do so. Therefore, the prudence of the executive power should be favored. The prudence or the discretion. And this capacity is what John Locke calls the prerogative. There is a prerogative of the executive when it comes to take foreign policy decisions. In the domain of foreign policy, in which the law, I quote, can by no means provide for, We must leave to the discretion of the executive power to decide what is required. The power to decide in foreign policy is a discrete power of the executive body. This power to act for the public good, the interest of the state, if we use Machiavelli's term, the national interest, if we use a more contemporary term, the power to act according to the national interests is called prerogative. There is a prerogative favorable to the executive body, which amounts to saying that it should not be controlled or checked, neither by the legislative body nor by directly the citizens themselves. The prerogative is the latitude, the freedom, could we say, left to the executive power when dealing with the outside world. The prerogative is the latitude left to the executive power. So Locke's analysis, though starting from a conception of the state of nature, somehow perfectly opposed to Hobbes's analysis of the state of nature, nevertheless ends up in exactly the same political recommendation. Foreign policy of Hobbes, as or as Machiavelli, foreign policy should be conducted by the executive power. Locke inspired the founding fathers of the American Constitution, the three Federalists who published their Federalist papers, John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, first and foremost, because he wrote those papers dealing with the foreign policy to come of the United States of America. They do not use the term prerogative, but they use a synonym almost perfectly similar. They use the term energy. Energy is needed to cope with foreign threats. Listen to this. Energy, this is the Federalist paper number 70. Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. The executive body must be characterized by energy. It is essential, this energy, and here we come to our domain, to the protection of the community against foreign attacks. To cope with foreign attacks, the prerogative or the energy of the executive power is necessary. In the conduct of war, I go on going, the energy of the executive protects the national security. And the legislative body, the American Congress, we'll come back to it immediately, is unable to do so. Why? Because it is a plural body. There are that many opinions regarding what to do to cope with the threat. The multitudinous, Federalist number 75, composition of the legislative body forbids us to expect in it those qualities which are essential to the proper execution or implementation of foreign policy. To conduct a successful foreign policy, unity or energy is absolutely necessary. Accurate knowledge of foreign politics, a steady and systematic adherence to the same views, a nice and uniform sensibility to the national character, decision, secrecy, and dispatch are incompatible with so numerous and variable a body as the legislative body. Secrecy, dispatch, decision, unity only exists in the federal government, and more specifically in the president, that is to say, the executive power. So realist, liberal thinkers such as the Federalists, the American Federalists, inspired by Locke, nevertheless, just as Locke to some extent, as we saw some minutes ago, accepted the realist view of international politics, somehow by definition different from domestic politics. And they drew the same conclusion, of course, as in the domain of the executive powers or the president's powers, the president's privilege, the primacy in the making of foreign policy. Federalist paper number 23, in the domains of the preservation of public peace against external attacks, because it is impossible to foresee, just as Locke had said, or to define the required actions. No, listen to this, no constitutional shackles can be imposed on the power to which the care of the Republic is committed. He who cares, that is to say, the president, for the security of the United States must be free to do what he thinks it is necessary to do. No constitutional shackles. And the view of the Federalists, who were favorable to the federal constitution, which was adopted in 1787, 11 years after the concrete independence of the former British colonies, the American Constitution obviously listened to the Federalists. At least it is the case according to Tocqueville's interpretation of the Constitution in his Democracy in America, where he studied, among many things, how the American regime, political regime worked. This is what he said regarding decision-making in foreign policy. The federal constitution tends, in some degree, to detach the general foreign policy of the Union of the United States from the control of the people. So the control of the people does not exist when it comes to foreign policy decisions. I go on quoting, it cannot therefore be said, it cannot be said with truth that the external affairs of the United States cannot be said that the external affairs of the United States are conducted by the democracy. There is no democracy when America is conducting its foreign policy, according to Tocqueville, and he, of course, is favorable to this position. So let's then look, ladies and gentlemen, logically at America's constitution, the text, and then the practice, and this then will contribute to explain the contemporary reality of American presidents deciding whatever they want, almost whatever they want, for 30 years now, regarding the wars that they decided to launch and the ones that we are interested in analyzing. The American Constitution, ladies and gentlemen, is indeed, or has been interpreted in a way which precisely gave rise to what the historian Arthur Schlesinger has called the imperial presidency. When we look at the American Constitution, the first thing that we see is the hierarchy. It establishes between the various bodies, the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. And the hierarchy is favorable, the formal hierarchy, the way the different articles are enumerated, the hierarchy is favorable to the legislative. The first and the longest article, Article 1, as you see on the slide, concerns the legislative power. This obviously is easy to understand, given the then the context of America's independence war against the British. So they wanted they rejected to some extent everything that directly or indirectly reminded the British monarchy, though this monarchy was parliamentary. So in our domain then, Article 1, Section 1, the legislative powers are vested in the Congress, which is composed by the Senate and the House of Representatives. And the Section 8 of this first article then enumerates some enumerates the powers, that is to say, those domains that should be decided by the Congress. And regarding our domain here, the first power of the Congress consists in regulating commerce with foreign nations. This today a bit surprising detailed point also should be explained by then the context. Remember what George Washington would say, the first American president, in his farewell address, when he gave advice to his followers, to his successors, sorry, that America's conduct, rule of conduct when dealing with the outside world should be to extend the commercial relations as much as possible and to have as little as possible political connections. At the end of the 18th century, then, the American founding fathers were interested in having trade. So trade was the most important, at least in their vision, the most important external action. And since the legislative power in their perception was the most important political body, the most democratic one, it was logical that this trade was the first international action to which the Constitution alludes to, and it is logical that it belonged to the Congress to decide to regulate, to decide what to do to regulate trade between America and the foreign world. The Congress also should have power to declare war, and here then we come to our topic. This point, of course, is pretty important. It is also important when we think of the draft of the Constitution, the first draft. In an early draft, the Constitution, first draft of the Constitution, Congress even had the power to make war, not to declare, but to make. And then during the discussions which led to the definitive version of the Constitution, which is still valid nowadays, the term to make war was deleted and replaced by to declare a war. What was the meaning of this claim, of this point? The meaning was that the Congress had the power to declare wars, which meant that the president did not have the possibility to launch wars without Congress declaring war. So we see here the hierarchy favorable to the Congress in the written Constitution. There must be a declaration of war, and only then can America launch a war. The president can decide a war. The Congress, the approval of the Congress is absolutely indispensable. It is the preliminary condition that must be met before America decides to go to war. The president, however, and this is an interpretation already because it is not as such in the Constitution, the president has the possibility to repeal a tax. When America is attacked, then it belongs to the president to take the decisions necessary to permit America to defend itself. But when America takes the initiative of going to war, then this war must be declared by the Congress. The president cannot launch this war. And the reason why it belonged to the president to repeal a tax, the reason was an institutional one. The legislative power, the president is permanently at office 365 days a year, which is not the case of the legislative body, which is vacant during some periods. So if an attack occurs during the period of vacancy of the American Congress, well, the president must act in order for America to be able to defend itself. But with the exception of this attacks that America is a victim of, when America decides to launch a war, then there must be a declaration, a formal declaration of war by the American Congress. So let's come to the power of the president. Beyond the president's power to repeal a tax, so a defensive power, the president also, Article 2, Section 2.1, Paragraph 1, the president is the commander-in-chief of the Army and of the Navy of the United States. And of the militia, remember that then American Army was composed by citizens. We saw this in our chapter 6, and citizens had the right to have guns, and this is at the origin of the Second Amendment, which nowadays is still valid in the US, and the discussions when mass shootings occur are due to the Second Amendment, which itself goes back to America's army being a militia of citizens, the citizens' army. So the president shall be the commander-in-chief of the army. That is to say, once a war is declared by the Congress, it belongs to the president to concretely conduct the war, to take the decision regarding the concrete actions that should be undertaken in order to wage the war when it was declared, or when the president must defend the US in the case of America being attacked. So this is the text, ladies and gentlemen, and the interpretation of the president's defensive war power, if we can call it this way. When we look then at the practice, because as usual, the constitutional practice is at least as important as the constitutional text. There is no legal text without an interpretation, and the interpretation, of course, is likely to evolve according to the context, thus giving birth to different practices over time. If we look at the practice, at the reality, what do we see? We see that the last time, ladies and gentlemen, that America declared a war, the last time that America declared a war in the strict legal formal meaning of the term was in 1941. In 1941, when America declared war to Japan after Pearl Harbor, and then to Nazi Germany. America also had declared war against Imperial Germany in 1917 when it entered World War I. But ever since 1941, America has declared no war. That is to say, it wages wars without declaring them. And actually, this already had been the case before World War I. The wars that permitted America to conquer the territories from Texas to California, the southern US states that had been former part of Mexico, the northern part of Mexico became the southern part of the US. These wars were launched by President Polk in 1848 without any declaration of war, so the Congress did not intervene. When Lincoln launched a blockade against the southern US states, the secessionist states, he took this decision: a blockade is an act of war, without asking any authorization and without any declaration of war on behalf of the Congress. When President Truman intervened in Korea after North Korea attacking South Korea in 1950, no declaration of war. When President Eisenhower sent American troops in Lebanon in 1958, the first time America intervened in the Middle East, no declaration of war. When President Kennedy launched America's war in Vietnam, and when President Nixon a bit later decided that American troops should intervene in Cambodia too, beyond Vietnam, there was no declaration of war. So American presidents, to some extent, violated the American Constitution, or at least they did not respect it, or they did not respect the text of the American Constitution. How then did they manage to do so? How was it possible that they bypassed Article 1, Section 1? Well, they used different legal mechanisms in order to precisely bypass this Section 8 of Article 1. Either they said that they acted on a defensive basis. This is what Polk did in 1848. But you can imagine that he provoked a situation which permitted him to claim that he was acting defensively, that is to say, on the basis of the president allowed to repeal a tax. Precisely what had happened in 1848. Texas had become independent, or it was not American yet, but it was no longer Mexican. And so in order to support Texas independence before, this was his final aim, of course, before asking Texas to join the US, what did Polk do? He sent American soldiers into the disputed territories between independent Texas and Mexico. And these, of course, soldiers were attacked by the Mexicans because they considered them to be enemies since they supported independent Texas. And thus, the American president had a pretext to invade, to get rid of Mexico by attacking not merely on the border of Texas, but also Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, etc., etc. So the first means used by American presidents is to provoke a kind of crisis, which will then permit them to claim that they act defensively. The second means resorted to by American presidents is to refer to an international legal dimension. In 1950, there was no declaration of war by the American Congress because a UN resolution had been adopted, not by the UN Security Council, but by the UN General Assembly, permitting the member states of the UN to intervene against North Korea, guilty of an offensive war of aggression against South Korea. And since international law is considered to be superior to national law, well, America, or the American president at that time, Truman, had a legal basis, but an international legal basis, not the constitutional basis of America's constitution. And more generally, of course, they act on the basis of Article 2, Section 2, Paragraph 1, that is to say, they are the commander-in-chief, and then and therefore they somehow consider they have the right to do what they want to do. And this gradual evolution, with presidents almost acting independently of any somehow credible control of the Congress, led in 1973, because of Nixon's behavior, and also more so because of Nixon's Watergate scandal, this situation led the Congress to try to rebalance the decision-making process. And the American Congress adopted in 1973 the famous War Powers Act. So the War Powers Act of 1973 first requires the president to consult with Congress before introducing American forces abroad. So the American president must consult. He cannot de facto, on the basis of his own decision, decide to send troops abroad without consulting with the Congress. The Congress also may request further information which the president is supposed to give. What's more, after 60 days, that is to say, at the latest 60 days after the president sent American troops abroad to wage a war, this is what that concretely means. Of course, what is the president supposed to do? He has to put an end to this military operation, except if the Congress either has declared war, then we come back to the original American Constitution, or the Congress has enacted a specific authorization. Of course, the Congress also can extend the periods of 60 days, as you say, authorize 30 more days, for instance, or in the case of an attack of the US by a foreign enemy, we come back to the original constitution, then, of course, the president is allowed to go on waging the war concerned. So the aim of this War Powers Act was to introduce precisely the checks and balance system that is to say, in order, the aim was to control what the president concretely was doing. According to Schlesinger, the limits, the impact of this War Powers Act was almost completely inefficient. There was almost no impact. Why? Because, according to Schlesinger, this War Powers Act actually permitted the president to do what the Constitution, original one, did not permit it to do. By saying that the president shall consult before introducing US forces abroad, the War Powers Act actually agrees in saying that the president can send troops. He merely has to consult, but the Constitution did not permit this, except in the case of defense. Now, even in the case of an offensive behavior on behalf of the US itself, the American president can do what he thinks is necessary to do. The only limit is to consult. But to consult with Congress does not mean to listen to the Congress in the case of the Congress not agreeing with the president. And remember that in the US sometimes, and pretty often actually, I would say almost 50% of the time, the Congress has not the same majority, political majority, as the president. Maybe the majority may be made by Democrats with a Republican president, and vice versa. So the president must consult, but there is no obligation to listen. The Congress may request further information, but there is no obligation for the Congress to do so. So if the Congress is not interested in having more information, by definition, the president has a blank check to do what he's eager to do. And what's more, ever since this War Powers Act has been adopted, when we look at the concrete wars that America has been fighting, it has never concretely prevented a president, an American president, to do what he was eager to do. There is one exception, it is Kosovo, where Clinton indeed had to ask an extension of the 60-day periods. The America's intervention within NATO lasted, as far as I remember, 3 months and a half, or a bit more than 3 months, so a bit more, so more than 60 days. This is the only exception. All the other wars were either shorter or based on other authorizations, and therefore the War Powers Act was not put into practice. For instance, this was the case under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan invaded Grenada, a small Caribbean island, to overthrow the somehow pro-Moscow revolutionary government. He bombed Gaddafi in Libya in 1986. I think, as far as I remember, a daughter of Gaddafi was killed. Libya, or Gaddafi, had staged a terrorist attack in Berlin, and American troops had been killed, of course, in 1980, still during the Cold War. Bush Farmer's Operation Desert Storm in 1991 was authorized by a UN resolution, so it's similar to Truman intervening against North Korea. The same is true for America's intervention in Bosnia in 1995, a UN resolution. And more important more relevant and more significant in our perspective here regarding America's war since 2001, America's war against terror, that is to say, America's intervention in Afghanistan 2001, in Iraq 2003, in Libya 2011, and against ISIS in 2014. Since 2014, these interventions, ladies and gentlemen, were based on specific authorizations. So when you look at the War Powers Act, you see that it is possible for the government for the Congress to enact a specific authorization. And in this case, there is no more need for the president to ask the authorization to extend beyond the 60 days period. And this is exactly what happened after 2001. First resolution, joint resolution by the two the House of Representatives and the Senate was adopted on September 18. So 1 week after the attacks of 9/11, the authorization for use of U.S. armed forces. And look at the text. The president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines. So it is the president who he determines who should be the target of America's military actions, because he considers them to be guilty directly or indirectly of the terrorist attacks. And look at the second part of this resolution. The Congress declares that this section is intended to constitute a specific authorization, so precisely the specific authorization alluded to by the War Powers Act of 1973. In 2001, therefore, to put it differently, the US Congress accepted to permit the president to do whatever he thought was necessary to do in order to successfully cope with the threat emanating from terrorists. The second resolution was adopted in 2002, October 16, in order to permit George W. Bush, the son, to do whatever he thought was necessary to get rid of Saddam Hussein, though there was no, we already saw this, direct link between the terrorist attacks and the behavior of Saddam Hussein. Look at the resolution. The president is authorized to use America's armed forces as he determines. Once again, a green light is given by the Congress. The Congress, to some extent, abandons any claim to control what the American president is doing. And once again, an allusion to the specific authorization of the War Powers Resolution. The kill list we mentioned last week and at the very beginning of today's lecture, established by the CIA and signed by Obama precisely, is part of this freedom of America's presidents since 2001, so more than 20 years now, to do what they determine should be done. So since 2001, America's presidents are doing whatever they want. And if I mention Obama, it is for a specific reason. When he came to power, to the White House, he was a little bit uncomfortable with what was going on. Also because he was a political opponent to George W. Bush, of course. You know that he decided to diminish and then to withdraw America's troops from Iraq. And he even went as far as saying that maybe this authorization, which went back to the terrorist attacks, should be abandoned. This is what he said in a speech held on May 23, 2013 at the National Defense University. Look at this. The choices we make about war can impact the freedom, the openness of our American way of life. And this is why, look at that, I intend to engage Congress about the existing AUMF, the authorization to use military force, the one adopted in 2001, a week after 9/11. Look at the quote. The AUMF is now nearly 12 years old. The Afghan war is coming to an end. Well, this is wrong because he refused to withdraw the troops. Biden did this last summer. Al-Qaeda is a shell of its former self. In years to come, not every collection of thugs that labels themselves as Al-Qaeda will pose a credible threat. So America should stop considering all the terrorist networks as serious threats to America's security. So logically then, he looks forward, I quote, to engaging Congress and the American people in efforts to refine and ultimately repeal the AUMF's mandate. We should no longer go on resorting to this authorization. We should once again re-establish the checks and balanced system which characterized American democracy. This war, like all wars, must end. This is what history advises, and this is what our democracy demands. Our democracy demands that I, Barack Obama, America's president, should be controlled directly by the American Congress, and therefore indirectly by the American citizens, by the American people. So this is what he promised. And in 2014, what did he do? He decided America should intervene against ISIS. So 1 year later, a bit more than 1 year after this speech was held, he decided that America should intervene, notably with special forces, special operation forces against ISIS in Syria, on the basis of the same authorization that in this speech he considered that should be abandoned. So yes, America's presidents are imperial presidents, and things are hardly different in France, ladies and gentlemen, where the Constitution of 1958, the Fifth Republic, is known for its the primacy that it acknowledges to the French president, French executive power, and within the executive power, the American president. Article 5 in our domain here: the president of the Republic shall be the guarantor of national independence, territorial integrity, due respect for treaties. Article 15: the president of the Republic, just as in the US, is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He shall provide over the higher national defense. The councils and committees preside over, actually, maybe. Anyway, so it is on the basis of these two articles, 5 and 15, that the president can engage France's forces in those military operations, that are taken on behalf of France's treaties, be they bilateral treaties, notably with African countries. Therefore, France intervenes very regularly in Ivory Coast, in Central Africa, in Chad, in Mali, etc., etc. But also multilateral treaties, that is the UN Charter, and therefore France, the UN Charter was a NATO treaty, and therefore France contributed to Desert Storm or to Operation Allied Force, and in Bosnia, and to Determined Force in Kosovo 1999. The same article is also at the origin of the president's authority to engage France's nuclear force. This authority was defined not by the Constitution, but by a decree of 1964. General de Gaulle was the then French president. He was criticized by Mitterrand, who was his left-wing or socialist opponent. But of course, once Mitterrand became president, what did he do? Well, he maintained the primacy of the executive, or of the president, in the domain of prospective nuclear war. This is what he said in 1983 during the Euro missile crisis, when there was a kind of perception that a nuclear war could break out between the then Soviet Union and the Western world. This is what he said in an interview with a French journalist. The masterpiece, listen to this: France's deterrence strategy is the head of state, and that there's myself, Mitterrand, I decide whether or not to use the nuclear weapon. Everything depends on his, the head of the state's, determination. And therefore, this interview was summed up in the phrase alluding to a phrase which is ascribed, rightly or wrongly, to Louis XIV. L'État, c'est moi. I am the French state. La dissuasion, c'est moi, Mitterrand. Mitterrand, I am the French deterrent. It belongs to the French president to decide whether or not to push on the nuclear button, and maybe, I hope I'm wrong, this is what Macron is thinking of, given the war in Ukraine and the somehow indirect warnings of Putin threatening the West with nuclear retaliation. Anyway, the president's primacy regards also the French government, that is to say, the second part of the executive power in France. Article 20, the government shall determine and conduct the policy of the nation. It shall have at its disposal the armed forces. So there's a potential contradiction. It is the government which has at its disposal the armed forces, that is to say, the prime minister, but it is the president who is the commander-in-chief and who is the guarantor of the national security and independence. So there's a contradiction, all the more so since Article 21 also claims that the prime minister is responsible for the national defense. So here again, as in the US, it is the practice which should be looked at rather than the text themselves. And what did the practice consist in? Well, always systematic. The president prevailed over the prime minister. This was the case when there was a gap, a discrepancy between the majority of the president and the majority of the government. For instance, from 86 to 88, Mitterrand was president, Chirac was the prime minister in 93, from 93 to 95. Mitterrand was president, Balladur was the prime minister. And again, from 1997 to 2002, Chirac was the president and Jospin, the socialist, was prime minister. And whenever there was a kind of divergence between the two, very regularly, the presidents, be it Mitterrand or Chirac, always reminded to everybody that they had to decide and not the prime minister. Listen to Mitterrand in 1987, when Chirac claimed that despite, I quote, the president's responsibility, the government's agreement, this is what Chirac said, the prime minister, constitutes a necessity. Mitterrand replied, France speaks with one voice, and this voice is the president's voice. So whatever Chirac was believing that he could do nothing if Mitterrand did not agree. The same happened again in 1994. Balladur was the prime minister. He was eager to resume France's nuclear tests. Mitterrand disagreed. This is what Mitterrand said. We disagree, but as it happens, it is the president of the republic who decides. That is to say, Mitterrand decided, Chirac, when he became president, decided that France should once again undertake nuclear tests in the Pacific Ocean. This is what he did in the second half of 1995. And Chirac himself, when he was president, was confronted to Jospin, the socialist prime minister. Jospin had a trip to Israel. And while talking to Israeli ministers, he designated the Lebanese Hezbollah, the Shia Hezbollah, as terrorists. In doing so, he somehow upset the French diplomacy, which, regarding the French-Arab conflicts, claims to maintain a kind of balance between the two belligerents, the Israelis on one hand and the Arabs on the other. So when Jospin came back home, came back to France, the Élysée, that is to say Chirac, published an official statement. Listen to this: the head of state reaffirms the continuity of France's foreign policy and the search for equilibrium balance, which characterizes our action in the Near East, an action which remains unchanged, whatever Jospin has dared to say. So the president prevails. So the president prevails over the parliament, the French National Assembly, and also over the French prime minister or government, but also, and all the more so, should I say, the president prevails over the French National Assembly, or the parliament. Look at Article 35. What is the role of the parliament? Article 35 in the French Constitution, pretty similar to the American one. A declaration of war shall be authorized by the parliament. So it is the parliament who has the authority to declare war. This was the original version of the Constitution, but just as in the case of America, from 58 up to 2008, during 50 years, the 51st years of the Fifth Republic, war French wars were never declared in the legal meaning of this term. 2008, why 2008? Because Sarkozy, President Nicolas Sarkozy, decided to adopt a reform. Here then we have the new version of Article 35, a declaration of war shall be authorized by Parliament. However, this is the new element, the government shall inform Parliament of its decision to send armed troops abroad at the latest 3 days after. So the initiative comes from the president, but he has to inform the Parliament. The Parliament can decide that the debate should take place, but there is no vote. So if the Parliament disagrees, it will have no impact upon the ongoing operation, military operation. However, if this operation exceeds 4 months, so 120 days, twice the American 2 months periods, in this case, the French government shall submit the extension to Parliament for authorization. So the reform somehow comes close to introducing in the French constitution what is prevailing in America since the War of Powers Act. What is interesting, ladies and gentlemen, is once again how this reform was put into practice, what concretely happened. Since 2008, this article was put into practice to permit the extension of French presence in Afghanistan, to permit in 2011 Operation L'Harmattan, the French name of the French operation against Gaddafi, to go on 4 months after its start in March 2011. Gaddafi was killed in October, so more than 6 months or some 6 months after the beginning of the operation. In Mali, where Holland sent troops in 2013, January 2013, this operation was turned into Operation Barkhane, the whole Sahel region. Also, this Article 35 was respected. And in November 2015, after France's intervention against ISIS, once again, the Parliament authorized the extension of the 4-month period. It still is valid nowadays. So to some extent, and this is different from the US, the article was indeed respected in France. But what I would like to emphasize, ladies and gentlemen, is what happened in the different cases concerned, and more specifically in 2008, precisely when, for the first time, this article was put into practice, when Sarkozy decided that France should go on maintaining its troops in Afghanistan. As a matter of fact, before the debate started, on the basis of this new version of Article 35, what did Nicolas Sarkozy do? He sent a letter to the French representatives at the Assemblée Nationale. Look at the letter that he sent. I attach the greatest importance, etc., so I welcome any debate. This is cheap talk, of course. This debate contributes to strengthening the rights of the Parliament that I, Sarkozy, wanted with the reform, the one that introduced the new version of Article 35. But then he starts, I think so, trying to influence the decision of the Parliament. The future of Afghanistan is a major issue for the security of our country, for the values we defend. So I want you to permit me to maintain the troops in France, in Afghanistan, because France's security is at stake, because our values must be promoted, defended and promoted, in this case in Afghanistan. So the Prime Minister at that time, Fillon, and I look forward to constructive debate. So we welcome a debate, but please take care, make clear that this debate is a constructive one, rather than consisting in criticizing. And then he straightly says what he will do. We will stay as long as necessary. We will stay as long as necessary. It would be unworthy of France to give up. This issue involves our security, as I already mentioned, our values, our place in the world. It is important, particularly important, that the national representation, that members of parliament express to our soldiers, we form a national community, our soldiers, and to the Afghan people, of course, the support their courage calls for in the face of barbarism. We are coping with the barbarians, the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda network. So we have to support our soldiers because our security is at stake, our values, and France's place and rank in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, every debate is welcomed. But if the result should consist in approving what the president has decided to do, what is such a debate worth? If there is no vote as specified, shall not be, the debate shall not be followed by a vote, what is the use of such a debate? If everybody knows in advance that the French president will go on doing what he is eager to do. So the executive power, to some extent, with this performative ladder, and in this case, the president more specifically, with this performative ladder, tells the legislative power what to do. If a debate is supposed to produce a result in accordance with the policy decided by the government, is it still a debate? The president decides. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is all the more so true if we look at what happened a bit more than 3 years later in 2012, January 2012. What did Nicolas Sarkozy decide to do? He decided that France should withdraw the troops, those troops that needed France's support in order to cope with barbarism, in order to promote France's values, in order to guarantee France's security, in order to permit France to maintain its place in the role, its place and role and rank in the world. These troops, he decided that they should be withdrawn 3 years later. Look at this, the French army is on its allies' side, but we cannot accept that our soldiers are killed. It is unacceptable, and I will not accept it. We cannot accept, we France, I will not accept it. I am the spokesperson of France, not the parliament, the members of parliament. France will immediately drop all the consequences if the soldiers die. It is a difficult decision that we will have to take, but I will assume the responsibility in face of the French and our soldiers. So he decides 4 years after, less than 4 years after deciding that France should maintain its troops, he decides that France should withdraw its troops. The president in France, just as in the US, is an imperial president. It is France's so-called domaine réservé. And some weeks ago, ladies and gentlemen, Macron, the French president, nowadays president, decided France should withdraw from Mali. Who had decided that France should intervene in Mali? It was Hollande, the then French president in 2013. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, or no, actually. Our Western liberal democracies, executive powers are not tamed. Our princes are untamed, and we will see next week that this lack of accountability, this lack of democracy is reinforced by the role played by mainstream media, whom I consider to be our government's little helpers. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending today's lecture. I wish you a great day and hope to see you again in a week. Goodbye.